The blood-red sunset painted the vast Montana sky as Rebecca Blackburn clutched her daughter's empty cradle, her heart as hollow as the wooden vessel that once held her most precious treasure. Tears blurred her vision as she placed the hand-carved oak cradle on her porch with a small sign, "For sale, $50." The cradle her husband Thomas had lovingly crafted before typhoid fever claimed him just 3 months ago, leaving her alone with 6-month-old Emma in a world that showed little mercy to widows. Montana Territory, 1878. Rebecca had exhausted every option to keep their small homestead running. The drought had withered her modest vegetable garden, and what little savings Thomas had left were dwindling faster than the creek behind their cabin. Emma whimpered from inside the cabin, her small cries piercing Rebecca's heart as she wiped away tears with the back of her hand. Selling Thomas's cradle felt like betraying his memory, but feeding their daughter mattered more than sentimentality. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Rebecca from her despair. She quickly straightened her worn calico dress and tucked loose strands of auburn hair beneath her bonnet. A stranger on horseback approached, a tall figure silhouetted against the fading light. "Evening, madam," the man called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. His voice carried a gentle timbre that contrasted with his imposing frame. "Mason Ingram's the name, just passing through these parts." Rebecca nodded politely, maintaining a cautious distance. Strangers could mean trouble for a woman alone, even in a relatively peaceful territory like Montana. "Rebecca Blackburn," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Mason's eyes moved to the cradle, and Rebecca noticed they were a startling shade of blue against his sun-weathered face. "Selling this fine piece?" he asked, running a calloused hand over the smooth oak. The craftsmanship was evident even in the fading light. Thomas had spent weeks carving delicate wildflowers along the headboard. "Yes," Rebecca said simply, suppressing the knot in her throat. $5. Mason studied her face more than the cradle, taking in the dark circles beneath her eyes and the determined set of her jaw. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. "Seems worth every penny of 10 to me," he said, counting out the coins. Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, but was interrupted by Emma's increasingly distressed cries from inside. "Excuse me," she murmured, hurrying inside. The small cabin revealed the extent of Rebecca's struggles. Few furnishings remained beyond the essentials, and the pantry shelves stood nearly empty. Emma lay in a makeshift bed of blankets on the floor, her tiny face red with exertion. Rebecca scooped up her daughter, bouncing her gently. "Shh, my sweet one. Mama's here." But Emma's cries only intensified, her little body rigid with discomfort. A gentle knock on the doorframe startled Rebecca. Mason stood in the doorway, the cradle in his arms. "Might I come in, Mrs. Blackburn?" he asked, his voice barely audible over Emma's cries. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. No man had entered her home since Thomas's passing, but there was something in Mason's eyes that didn't trigger alarm. "Teething, is she?" Mason asked, setting the cradle down near the hearth. Rebecca nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" A sad smile crossed his face. "My sister had 4 little ones. I helped with all of them when her husband was working their claim." He approached slowly, hands visible. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Emma. Against her better judgment, Rebecca handed over her precious bundle. Mason cradled Emma with surprising gentleness for such large hands. He began to hum softly, a melody Rebecca didn't recognize, while gently pressing his thumb against Emma's sore gums. To Rebecca's astonishment, Emma's cries subsided to whimpers, then to soft hiccups. "My sister swore by clove oil," Mason said softly. "I happen to have some in my saddlebag. Would be honored to share it." Rebecca watched as this stranger, this cowboy, rocked her daughter with the ease of someone who understood children. When Emma's eyes finally fluttered closed, Mason carefully placed her in the cradle he had just purchased and began to rock it gently. "You're good with her," Rebecca whispered, afraid to break the spell of quiet that had descended. Mason's eyes remained on Emma. "Children are honest souls. They know when they're safe." He looked up at Rebecca. "Madam, I don't mean to overstep, but that cradle, I'd like you to keep it, and the money too." Rebecca stiffened. "We don't accept charity, Mr. Ingram." Mason nodded, respecting her pride. "Not charity, a fair trade. I've been on the trail for weeks, heading to my new property near Whitefish Creek. Could use a home-cooked meal and maybe some conversation that doesn't involve my horse." Rebecca assessed the stranger. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner respectful, and something in his eyes spoke of dependability. "I don't have much to offer," she admitted. "Bean soup and cornbread is all I've managed today." "Sounds like a feast to me," Mason replied with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. As Rebecca stirred the meager soup, adding the last of her dried herbs, she cast glances at Mason, who continued to rock Emma gently. There was something both strange and comforting about having a man's presence in the cabin again. His story unfolded between spoonfuls of soup. He'd spent 10 years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana, saving every penny to buy his own land. Now at 32, he finally had a small ranch to call his own, though it needed considerable work. "And you, Mrs. Blackburn, how long have you been out here?" he asked, breaking off a piece of cornbread. Rebecca's story spilled out in fragments how she and Thomas had come west from Pennsylvania 3 years ago, full of dreams. How they'd built this cabin with their own hands. How Thomas had fought the fever for 2 weeks before succumbing. How the neighboring homesteaders had helped with the burial, but had their own struggles to attend to. "I've been trying to make it work," she concluded, her voice barely audible. "But without Thomas," she gestured helplessly at the cabin around them. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Winter's coming soon. Have you thought about what you'll do?" Rebecca's shoulders sagged. "My parents back east would take us in, but the train fare—" She shook her head. "I'm still hoping for a miracle." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and Emma's gentle breathing. Mason seemed to be considering something, his brow furrowed in thought. "Mrs. Blackburn, I have a proposition for you," he finally said, his tone careful. "My place needs a woman's touch, something fierce. And I could use help getting it ready before winter. Would you consider coming to work for me? You and Emma would have your own room, and I'd pay fair wages." Rebecca's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't know this man, and going to his isolated property could be dangerous. Yet survival instinct whispered that staying here alone was equally perilous. "I need time to consider," she said cautiously. Mason nodded, standing to take his leave. "Of course. I'll be in town for 3 days, staying at the Mercantile. Whatever you decide, the Cradle stays here. It belongs with Emma." After he left, Rebecca sat by the cradle, watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Mason Ingram seemed honorable, but Thomas had taught her caution. The next morning, she hitched her old mare to the wagon and drove into town with Emma bundled against her chest. Walter Jenkins, the Mercantile owner, had known Thomas well. "Mason Ingram?" he repeated when Rebecca inquired discreetly. "Yes, he's staying in the room upstairs. Paid 3 months in advance for supplies to be delivered to his new place." Walter leaned closer. "Checked him out myself when he first came through. He worked for the Hammond outfit for years, they vouch for him. Honest to a fault, they say." Rebecca nodded, relief mingling with something else she couldn't quite name. She made her decision that evening as she tried to stretch the last of her cornmeal to make another day's bread. 2 days later, she found herself loading her meager possessions into Mason's wagon. Emma's cradle was secured carefully among their belongings. The neighbors watched with a mixture of concern and understanding as Rebecca left the homestead that contained both her happiest memories and deepest sorrows. The journey to Mason's property took most of the day, winding through pine forests and meadows still vibrant with late summer wildflowers. Emma, securely wrapped against Rebecca's chest, cooed at the swaying trees overhead. "Just over this ridge," Mason finally announced as the sun began its westward descent. He slowed the wagon, allowing Rebecca to take in the view that spread before them. A valley opened up, cradled by gentle hills covered with ponderosa pines. A creek curved through the center, its banks lined with cottonwoods turning golden in the early autumn light. The cabin that stood near the creek was larger than Rebecca had expected, though clearly in need of repair. A small barn and corral stood nearby, and a garden plot had been recently turned. "It's not much yet," Mason said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But the land's good. Water's plentiful even in drought years, according to the previous owner." "It's beautiful," Rebecca said honestly, feeling the first stirrings of hope in months. The inside of the cabin revealed Mason's bachelor status clearly. It was clean but Spartan, with minimal furniture and no decorative touches. A large main room contained a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with chairs, and a kitchen area. 2 doors led off from the main room. "That one's yours and Emma's," Mason said, pointing to the right. "I've been sleeping in the other." "There's a new lock on your door," he added, his tone matter of fact. "Keys on the table inside." The gesture understanding her need for security increased Rebecca's confidence in her decision. The room was simple, but contained a proper bed with a straw mattress, a small dresser, and enough space for Emma's cradle. "Thank you," she said simply. "We'll unload your things, then I'll see to the animals," Mason replied. "You and Emma rest. Been a long day." That first evening established a pattern that would carry them through the following weeks. Rebecca took charge of the cabin's interior, cooking meals and creating order from Mason's haphazard housekeeping. Mason worked from dawn until dusk, repairing the roof, reinforcing the barn, and preparing the property for winter. They circled each other cautiously at first, 2 lonely souls aware of both opportunity and danger in their arrangement. Rebecca kept Emma close, and Mason maintained a respectful distance, never entering their room, always announcing his presence before entering the cabin. The first breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered Mason's books. A small trunk beneath his bed contained a collection of volumes ranging from practical farming guides to poetry and classics. Finding him reading by lantern light one evening, she couldn't hide her surprise. "My mother was a school teacher," he explained, almost embarrassed. "Reading was non-negotiable in our home." Rebecca smiled, settling in a chair across from him, with her mending. "My father was the same. He read to us every night, even after working 14 hours at the steel mill." Their shared love of literature opened conversations beyond the daily tasks of survival. They discovered mutual favorites: Dickens for his characters, Whitman for his celebration of America's wild beauty. Mason's voice, deep and steady, became a nightly comfort as he read aloud while Rebecca sewed or mended. Emma, for her part, thrived in their new home. The clove oil Mason provided eased her teething pain, and the fresh mountain air brought healthy color to her cheeks. Most surprising to Rebecca was how Emma responded to Mason, cooing and reaching for him whenever he entered the room. "She's a natural judge of character," Rebecca remarked one evening, as Mason gently rocked Emma's cradle with his foot while reading. Mason's smile was tinged with sadness. "Children are. My sister's little ones were the light of my life before." He trailed off. "Before?" Rebecca prompted gently. Mason closed his book. "Influenza took them 3 winters ago. My sister, her husband, all 4 children. I was driving cattle in Colorado. By the time I got word and returned, they were all gone." His voice remained steady, but the pain in his eyes was raw. Rebecca reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. "I'm so sorry." Mason nodded, his gaze fixed on their hands. "It's why I understood about the cradle. Some things carry too much memory to let go, even when practical matters demand it." That night marked a shift in their relationship. The careful distance they'd maintained began to close, not through physical proximity, but through the sharing of griefs too heavy to carry alone. Rebecca spoke more freely of Thomas, his laugh, his optimism, the future they had planned. Mason listened, offering not empty consolations, but understanding nods and, occasionally, his own memories of loved ones lost. As September gave way to October, the valley blazed with autumn colors. Mason's work on the property began to show significant progress. The roof no longer leaked. The barn stood sturdy against the increasing winds, and a smokehouse now contained enough preserved meat to see them through the winter. Rebecca had transformed the cabin's interior with simple touches: curtains made from flour sacks, a braided rug before the fireplace, wildflowers and tin cans on the table. Their days fell into comfortable rhythms. Mornings began with coffee shared at the table as they discussed the day's tasks. Mason would head out to continue his improvements while Rebecca tended to Emma, worked in the garden, harvesting the last vegetables, and kept the household running. Evenings were for shared meals, conversation, and, increasingly, laughter. It was during one such evening, as the first snow flurries danced outside the windows, that Rebecca realized something had fundamentally changed. Mason was whittling a small wooden horse for Emma while telling Rebecca about his first cattle drive. His stories always captivated her tales of lightning storms on open plains, river crossings gone wrong, characters met along dusty trails. But tonight, watching his hands skillfully shape the wood, listening to the low rumble of his voice, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. The realization startled her. Thomas had been gone less than 6 months. Was it disloyal to feel this flutter of attraction for another man? She excused herself earlier than usual that night, citing tiredness, and retreated to her room where she could sort through her conflicted emotions. Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, Thomas's cradle that Mason had insisted they keep. Rebecca ran her fingers over the carved wildflowers, tears welling in her eyes. "I miss you," she whispered to Thomas's memory. "I will always miss you, but I don't know if I can do this alone." No answer came except Emma's soft breathing and the wind whistling around the cabin eaves. Rebecca fell asleep, wondering what Thomas would want for them, for her to honor his memory through lonely fidelity, or to find happiness again, if the opportunity arose. The opportunity, however, seemed increasingly complicated. Though Mason treated her with unfailing respect and growing warmth, he maintained certain boundaries. He never discussed the future beyond immediate plans for the property. He spoke of Rebecca and Emma as welcome guests but not permanent fixtures in his life. And most tellingly, he sometimes rode out alone for hours, returning with a distant look in his eyes that discouraged conversation. The first heavy snow came in early November, transforming the valley into a wonderland of white. It also enforced a new intimacy as they were confined largely to the cabin. Mason worked on indoor projects, building shelves, repairing furniture, crafting wooden toys for Emma, who was now trying to crawl. Rebecca baked bread, sewed, and read from Mason's books when her other tasks were complete. It was during one such snowbound afternoon that Rebecca found Mason staring at Emma as she practiced pulling herself up on a chair, determination evident in her tiny features. "She has your stubbornness," Mason remarked with a smile. Rebecca laughed. "And her father's curiosity. Thomas was always taking things apart to see how they worked." Her voice still caught slightly when she mentioned him, but the sharp pain had dulled to a bittersweet ache. Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You loved him very much." "I did," Rebecca answered honestly. Then, feeling brave, she added, "But I'm learning that love doesn't end with loss. It changes, becomes part of you in a different way." Mason's blue eyes met hers, searching. "And is there room for new beginnings after such loss?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Rebecca felt her heart quicken. "I believe there can be," she said softly, "with time, with the right person." Mason seemed about to say more when Emma lost her grip on the chair and tumbled backwards with a startled cry. Both adults moved simultaneously to comfort her, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. Some door had been cracked open that neither could fully close again. The next day, Mason announced he needed to ride into town for supplies before the snow made the trails impassable. "I'll be gone overnight," he explained as he prepared his horse. "Will you and Emma be all right?" Rebecca assured him they would, though she felt an unexpected pang at the prospect of the empty cabin. As she watched him ride away, Emma balanced on her hip. She wondered what Mason might be thinking about their conversation from the previous day. Alone in the cabin, Rebecca found herself restless. She cleaned areas that didn't need cleaning, reorganized the pantry, and spent extra time playing with Emma. When her daughter finally fell asleep for her afternoon nap, Rebecca decided to seize the opportunity to air out Mason's room, a task she normally avoided when he was present, respecting his privacy. The room was neat, but utilitarian, much like the man himself. As she shook out his bedding, a small leather-bound book fell from between the mattress and frame. It opened as it hit the floor, revealing handwriting that she instantly recognized as Mason's a journal. Rebecca knew she should close it immediately. A journal was private, not meant for other eyes, but a single line caught her attention. "R and Emma bring life to this place in ways I never imagined possible." Her own initial, her daughter's name. Rebecca's hands trembled as she picked up the journal, her conscience battling curiosity. Curiosity won. The journal entries spanned the months since Mason had purchased the property. But the tone changed markedly after their arrival. Earlier entries spoke of isolation, determination, and lingering grief over his sister's family. Later ones revealed a man gradually awakening to new possibilities, finding joy in simple moments, Emma's smile, Rebecca's singing as she worked, evenings spent in comfortable conversation. But alongside these hopeful notes ran a current of doubt and self-recrimination. "Who am I to think I deserve such happiness?" one entry read, "after failing those who needed me most." Rebecca closed the journal, her heart heavy with the weight of Mason's private thoughts. She returned it carefully to its hiding place, understanding now the shadows that sometimes crossed his face, the reasons he maintained certain distances. When Mason returned the following evening, his arms full of supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper that he shyly presented to Rebecca, she saw him with new eyes, not just as the strong, capable man who had saved her and Emma from destitution, but as someone carrying his own burdens of grief and guilt. "It's not much," he said, as she unwrapped the package to find a pretty blue ribbon and a small glass bottle of lavender water. "Just saw them and thought you might like something frivolous." The gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Not just for these, but for everything. For giving us a home when we had none." Mason's expression softened. "You've given as much as you've received, Rebecca. This place wasn't a home until you and Emma arrived." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it pleased her. He quickly turned the conversation to practical matters, the supplies he'd purchased, news from town, preparations needed for the deepening winter. That night, as Rebecca braided her hair with the new ribbon, she made a decision. Mason needed healing as much as she did. Perhaps they could find it together if she could help him overcome the guilt he carried. Her opportunity came unexpectedly the following week. A blizzard had kept them housebound for days, and cabin fever was setting in. To break the monotony, Rebecca suggested they clear out an old trunk of household items the previous owner had left behind. Among the mismatched dishes and tarnished cutlery, Rebecca found a small tin box containing daguerreotypes. One showed a stern-faced couple standing before a cabin much like theirs. Another revealed a young woman holding an infant. "The Hendersons," Mason explained. "They homesteaded this place for 20 years before selling to me. Mrs. Henderson passed last winter. Mr. Henderson moved back east to live with their daughter." Rebecca studied the images, struck by the continuity of human experience in this remote valley, families living, loving, grieving, moving on. "Do you ever think about them? The people who lived here before?" Mason nodded, setting aside a chipped teapot. "Often, wonder if they found the happiness they were looking for, or if they just endured." "I think perhaps both," Rebecca said carefully. "Life rarely gives us pure happiness or pure sorrow. Mostly it's a mixture we have to sort through as best we can." She paused, gathering courage. "Mason, may I ask you something personal?" He tensed slightly but nodded. "You mentioned your sister's family died of influenza while you were away. Do you blame yourself somehow?" The directness of her question clearly startled him. For a moment, Rebecca feared she had overstepped, destroyed the delicate balance they had established. Mason's face closed, his jaw tightening as he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I promised my sister I'd always be there if she needed me. When the sickness came, she sent a telegram. I was 2 days' ride away. By the time I got there..." His shoulders hunched slightly. "The neighbor who'd been caring for them said my sister asked for me at the end. Wanted me to raise the children. I wasn't there." Rebecca rose and moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "And you think you failed her?" It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "I know I did. The way I failed Thomas by not recognizing how serious his fever was soon enough? By not getting the doctor earlier?" Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. "The way I've tortured myself thinking that if I'd done something differently, he might still be alive?" Mason turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "You couldn't have known? Sometimes illness takes hold too quickly, too strongly." "As it did with your sister's family," Rebecca said gently. "Mason, would you blame me for Thomas's death?" "Of course not," he replied immediately. "Then why blame yourself for circumstances equally beyond your control? The logic of her argument seemed to penetrate the armor of guilt he'd constructed. His expression softened. And for a moment, Rebecca thought he might reach for her. Instead, he turned back to the window. Knowing something here, he tapped his temple, isn't the same as feeling it here. His hand moved to his heart. Rebecca nodded, understanding all too well. No, but it's a start. The conversation marked another turning point. Though Mason didn't immediately shed years of self-recrimination, he seemed lighter somehow in the days that followed. He laughed more readily, spent more time playing with Emma, and his gaze lingered on Rebecca when he thought she wouldn't notice. December arrived with fierce cold but magnificent beauty. The valley lay transformed under its blanket of snow, trees sparkling with frost in the morning sunlight. Inside the cabin, Rebecca began preparations for Christmas, determined to make the holiday special, despite their isolation. She secretly sewed a new shirt for Mason from fabric she'd brought from her homestead, embroidering the collar with a simple pattern. For Emma, she crafted a rag doll using scraps of material. Mason, she noticed, was equally secretive about a project he worked on in the barn during the few hours of daylight. No peeking, he warned when she approached the barn one afternoon. Emma bundled against the cold in her arms. "Wouldn't dream of it," Rebecca replied with a smile, though curiosity burned within her. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black velvet sky. After a simple but festive dinner, they exchanged their gifts by firelight. Mason's face registered genuine pleasure at the shirt, his fingers tracing the embroidery with appreciation. "My turn," he said, disappearing briefly outside, only to return with something covered by a blanket. When he removed the covering, Rebecca gasped. Before her stood a rocking chair, beautifully crafted from pine, with a curved back and smooth armrests. The wood gleamed with layers of polish, and decorative elements had been carved along the top rail wildflowers that matched those on Emma's cradle. "Mason," she breathed, running her hand over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. Thought you might like somewhere comfortable to sit while tending to Emma," he explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "And I noticed how you admired the carvings on her cradle." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved Rebecca deeply. It represented hours of labor, careful observation of her preferences, and considerable skill. More than that, it suggested permanence. A rocking chair wasn't a gift one gave to a temporary housekeeper. "I love it," she said simply, sitting in the chair and finding it perfectly suited to her frame. Emma crawled over, pulling herself up on the rocker to investigate this new addition. As Rebecca settled Emma on her lap and began to rock gently, she looked up to find Mason watching them with an expression that made her heart skip. No longer guarded, his blue eyes held a warmth and longing that echoed her own feelings. "I have one more gift," Mason said softly, kneeling before the rocking chair. From his pocket, he withdrew a small cloth pouch. "This isn't much, and if it's too soon or not what you want, you only need say so." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the pouch. Inside, she found a simple gold ring with a small pearl, not an extravagant piece, but lovely in its understated elegance. "It was my mother's," Mason explained. "She left it to me, saying someday I might find someone I wanted to share my life with." He took a deep breath. "Rebecca, these past months with you and Emma have shown me what this place could be. Not just a property, but a home, a family." He hesitated, vulnerability plain on his face. "I know it might be too soon after Thomas, and I wouldn't rush you, but I wanted you to know my intentions, my hopes." Emma chose that moment to reach for the ring, her small fingers grasping at the shiny object. Both adults laughed, breaking the tension of the moment. "Perhaps Emma approves," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. "And so do I, Mason." "You do?" His expression held such hope that Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. "I do. Not as a replacement for what was lost, but as something new, something ours." She shifted Emma to one arm so she could touch Mason's face. "Thomas will always be part of me, as your sister and her children will always be part of you. But there's room in our hearts for more love, don't you think?" Mason covered her hand with his own. "I do." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Rebecca met him halfway, their lips touching in a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened with shared longing. Emma's babbling eventually separated them, both breathless and smiling. Mason took the ring and slipped it onto Rebecca's finger. "A promise," he said. "For now. When you're ready for more, you only need tell me." That Christmas night, as snow fell softly outside and Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, Rebecca and Mason sat before the fire, planning their future together. They would marry in the spring, when the roads cleared enough for the circuit preacher to visit. The property would become truly theirs, not his alone, but shared fully. They spoke of expanding the cabin as their family grew, of the garden Rebecca would plant when the snow melted, of the cattle Mason would add to their holdings. Winter passed in a haze of contentment, the hardships bitter cold, occasional shortages. Isolation seemed less daunting when faced together. Mason continued to read aloud in the evenings, but now Rebecca sat in her rocking chair with his arm around her shoulders. Their kisses grew more frequent, more confident, though both agreed to wait until their wedding night for greater intimacy. Emma thrived, taking her first steps in February, toddling unsteadily between them with triumphant giggles. Her vocabulary expanded to include mama and, to Mason's evident delight, pa. Rebecca had worried that the child might somehow be betraying her biological father's memory, but Mason handled the situation with characteristic sensitivity. "We'll make sure she knows about Thomas," he promised, "about how brave he was to bring you out here, how he built your first home with his own hands, how he carved her cradle with such love. She'll know she has two fathers, one watching over her from heaven, one here to raise her." Spring arrived late but gloriously, the valley erupting in wildflowers as the snow retreated. True to his word, Mason rode to town as soon as the trails cleared enough and returned with news that Reverend Simmons would visit in 2 weeks' time. Rebecca threw herself into preparations, wanting their wedding day to be special, despite its simplicity. She worked on a new dress using fabric Mason had purchased in town, a soft blue calico that matched her eyes. Mason, meanwhile, expanded their livestock, adding a milk cow, more chickens, and 2 pigs to their holdings. The day before the wedding, as Rebecca put final stitches in her dress, a wagon approached the cabin. To her astonishment, 4 women from town climbed down, arms laden with baskets. "Thought you might appreciate some female company before your big day," explained Martha Jenkins, the mercantile owner's wife. "No bride should prepare alone." The women had brought food, flowers, and wedding gifts, quilts, preserves, household items the young couple would need. More precious than these material offerings was the sense of community they represented. Rebecca had feared isolation in their remote valley. Now she realized Mason had been quietly building connections during his trips to town. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright. Rebecca dressed carefully in her new blue dress, arranging her hair with trembling fingers. Emma, now 15 months old, wore a tiny white dress Martha Jenkins had brought, fashioned from her own daughter's baptismal gown. When Rebecca emerged from her room carrying Emma, she found Mason waiting in the main room, dressed in a clean white shirt, the one she had made him for Christmas, and his best trousers. His face when he saw her contained such wonder that Rebecca felt tears threatening. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, reaching for her hand. Reverend Simmons conducted the simple ceremony before the fireplace where they had spent so many evenings. The Jenkins and a few other neighbors from town stood witness as Mason and Rebecca exchanged vows and rings the pearl ring for her, a simple gold band for him that had belonged to Rebecca's father. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the Reverend proclaimed before adding with a smile, "You may kiss your bride." Mason's kiss was tender, but held a promise of passion to come. The small gathering of guests applauded, and Emma, not to be left out, clapped her small hands in imitation. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Their neighbors had brought food and drink, and music was provided by Walter Jenkins on his fiddle. As the spring afternoon lengthened into evening, Rebecca found moments to marvel at how much had changed in less than a year. From the depths of despair, selling her husband's handcrafted cradle to feed their child, to this new beginning with a man whose gentle strength had helped heal her broken heart. As darkness fell, their guests departed with knowing smiles and good-natured teasing. Mason closed the door behind the last wagon and turned to Rebecca, suddenly shy despite the months of growing closeness. "Emma's asleep," Rebecca said softly, nodding toward the cradle where their daughter slumbered peacefully, unaware of the day's significance. Mason approached slowly, taking her hands in his. "I never thought I'd find this again, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." His voice was husky with emotion. "You've given me so much, Rebecca." "We've given each other second chances," she corrected gently. "And Emma, a father who loves her as his own." Their kiss deepened, no longer restrained by the boundaries they had respected during their courtship. When Mason lifted her into his arms and carried her toward what was now their shared bedroom, Rebecca went willingly, her heart full of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought this man to her doorstep on that desperate day when she'd tried to sell Emma's cradle. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Mason's heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Rebecca thought of Thomas. There was sadness still, but no longer the crushing grief that had once threatened to overwhelm her. In its place was gratitude for the time they'd had, for the daughter they'd created, and for the love that had helped her find the strength to begin again. "What are you thinking?" Mason murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Rebecca smiled in the darkness. "That life takes unexpected turns. That sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning in disguise." Mason's arms tightened around her. "Like a widow selling a cradle and finding not just a buyer, but a new father for her child, and a new love for herself," Rebecca added, lifting her face for his kiss. 1 year after their wedding, the valley resonated with the sound of hammers as Mason and 2 hired hands expanded the cabin. Rebecca watched from her garden, one hand resting on her swelling belly, as Emma, now a sturdy 2-year-old, helped plant bean seeds in the rich soil. The cradle that had once symbolized Rebecca's desperation now stood ready in the new nursery, waiting for the arrival of Emma's brother or sister. Mason had restored it carefully, reinforcing the joints and refreshing the finish, his hands caressing the wood Thomas had shaped with the same reverence he showed to Rebecca's changing body. "Do you ever wonder," Rebecca asked that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold, "what would have happened if you hadn't passed by that day? If you hadn't stopped to look at Emma's cradle?" Mason considered, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I believe some things are meant to be," he said finally. "Not that we don't have choices, we do. But sometimes paths cross at exactly the right moment, and the choice becomes clear." Emma climbed into Mason's lap, her small hands patting his face with sleepy affection. "Story, Pa," she demanded, her vocabulary now extensive, but her love of Mason's voice unchanged. Mason smiled, meeting Rebecca's gaze over their daughter's head. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a lonely cowboy who thought his heart was too broken to ever love again. Until one day, he saw a cradle for sale." Rebecca closed her eyes, savoring the deep timbre of his voice as he continued the story. Their story of loss and discovery, endings and beginnings, and a cradle that had brought together 2 wounded souls seeking healing. As the baby within her stirred, she offered silent thanks for second chances and the unexpected ways love finds its way home. 5 years later, the cabin had grown into a proper ranch house. The valley that had once seemed so isolated now bustled with activity. Ranch hands tending to the growing herd of cattle, neighboring families visiting for Sunday dinners, children playing in the yard. Emma, now 7, had been joined by 3 siblings, Joshua, age 4, and the 2-year-old twins, Sarah and Samuel. The original cradle had served each child in turn, and now sat in the attic, carefully preserved for the next generation. On a warm summer evening, as fireflies began to dance over the meadow, Rebecca stood at the kitchen window, watching Mason in the yard. He sat in a large rocking chair he'd built to replace her smaller one, now surrounded by their children, as he told them stories of cattle drives and adventures from his younger days. Emma leaned against his shoulder, her auburn hair so like Rebecca's, catching the last rays of sunlight. Joshua sat at Mason's feet, wide-eyed with admiration for his father. The twins climbed over him like puppies, secure in the knowledge of his unfailing patience. The scene before her filled Rebecca's heart to overflowing. The decades since Thomas's death had taught her that life's greatest blessings often emerge from its deepest sorrows. That love, once given, is never truly lost, but transforms and expands in ways impossible to imagine in moments of grief. Mason looked up, catching her gaze through the window. His smile, still capable of quickening her pulse after 6 years of marriage, held the same wonder and gratitude that had marked their beginning. He lifted a hand, beckoning her to join them. As Rebecca stepped onto the porch, Emma ran to meet her. "Mama, Pa's telling us about the first time he saw you." "Is he now?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow at her husband. "And what exactly is he saying?" Mason's blue eyes twinkled. "Just that I knew a good deal when I saw one. Best $10 I ever spent." $10 for a cradle? Joshua asked, perplexed. The cradle was just the beginning, Mason explained, making room for Rebecca beside him on the wide rocking chair. It came with a beautiful mother, a precious baby girl, and a future I couldn't have imagined. As the children clamored for more details of their parents' meeting, Rebecca leaned against Mason's strong shoulder, his arm secure around her waist. Together, they shared the story that had become family legend of a desperate young widow, a lonely cowboy, and the cradle that had brought them together. When the children finally fell asleep that night, exhausted from play and stories, Rebecca and Mason stood in the doorway of the girls' room. Sarah and Samuel slept in proper beds now, having outgrown the cradle years ago, but Rebecca could still picture each of her children in that simple wooden bed that had once seemed like the embodiment of her loss. "Sometimes I think about going back," she said softly as they moved to check on the boys. "To see the old homestead, to visit Thomas's grave." Mason nodded, understanding as always. "We could make the trip this fall, after harvest. Take the children. They should know that part of their history, too." Rebecca smiled up at him, grateful once again for the gentle heart that had recognized her grief without being threatened by it. "I'd like that. Not to dwell in the past, but to honor it." "The past made us who we are," Mason agreed, leading her to their bedroom. "Brought us where we needed to be." As they prepared for bed, Rebecca watched Mason's familiar movements, the careful hanging of his clothes, the washing of his face, the brush through his hair now flecked with silver at the temples. 6 years of marriage had deepened their connection in ways she couldn't have anticipated, creating a partnership that strengthened them both. Later, lying in the darkness with his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Rebecca whispered, "Do you ever regret it? Taking on a widow and her child when you could have started fresh with someone without my complications?" Mason's chest rumbled with a soft laugh. "Regret the greatest blessing of my life? Never." His arms tightened around her. "From the moment I saw you standing there with that cradle, trying so hard to be strong when your world was falling apart, I knew there was something special about you." Rebecca Blackburn. "Even though I was clearly a woman with a complicated past?" "Especially because of that," Mason replied, his voice tender. "Your strength, your capacity to love, even through loss, those were the qualities that drew me to you. Still do." Rebecca lifted her face for his kiss, marveling that after all their years together, his touch still kindled the same warmth within her. Their love had matured like fine wine, richer and deeper with the passing years, yet still capable of moments of breathtaking sweetness. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she confessed. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. And I never thought I deserved happiness after failing my sister," Mason replied. "We healed each other, I think." Rebecca nodded against his chest. "And it all began with a cradle and a crying baby. And a cowboy who recognized a treasure when he saw it," Mason added, his voice growing heavy with approaching sleep. As her husband's breathing deepened into slumber, Rebecca remained awake a while longer, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the occasional creak of the house settling, sounds of home, of security, of a life rebuilt from ashes. She thought of the cradle now stored in their attic, waiting perhaps for grandchildren yet to come. How an object created with love by one man had become the unexpected bridge to another love, equally deep but different. How loss and renewal were not opposing forces but part of the same current that carried all lives forward. As sleep finally claimed her, Rebecca's last conscious thought was one of gratitude for the cradle that had brought Mason to her door, for his gentle hands that had rocked Emma to sleep that first night, and for the courage they had both found to embrace a second chance at happiness. In the years that followed, their ranch prospered, their children grew tall and strong, and their love remained the steady foundation upon which everything else was built. The cradle that had once been a symbol of desperation became a treasured family heirloom, its story told and retold until it achieved almost mythic status among their descendants. And in every telling, the heart of the story remained the same: how the darkest moments can lead to unexpected light, how endings can become beginnings, and how a simple act of kindness can change the course of lives forever.